Welcome back, everyone. I'm excited to have our next author on the Long View. I'm Julian Zelizer. And Matthew Pinsker has written a really great book, which is coming out in February, I believe,
Yes.
but available now to pre-order everywhere. Boss Lincoln: The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln with Norton, which was really a fascinating read. So I jumped online to find you once I read it. So thanks for joining the Long View.
Well, thank you, Julian. I really appreciate the invitation.
So maybe we can just start off for those who have read a little bit about Lincoln and obviously know who he is. Can you explain, just to set up the contrast, how has he normally been depicted as a leader, as a president and a leader? And then you can tell us how you step in to offer a different view.
Well, there's been so many thousands of books about Lincoln. There's no normal way. But look, I think most people know Lincoln was a politician. That's not news. But what I try to do in the book is I try to write a biography of a party leader, what kind of partisan he was, behind the scenes in particular. Um, Not many people realize that over the course of his career, he helped build three different political parties: Whigs, Republicans, and Unionists. And the Unionists are the ones in particular who get left kind of on the side because the war is so important. But I argue in the book that they couldn't save the Union without building a Union party, and I think Lincoln deserves a lot of credit for that.
And when you're talking about party building in either three of those incarnations, what did that involve? What did it mean for Lincoln to be a party builder?
It is complicated. Parties were different then. Of course, there's always parties and factions in American politics. The founders sometimes detested each other. They organized against each other, especially in the early republic. Everybody knows about the Jeffersonians and the Hamiltonians. And then there's the battles between Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay, the Democrats and the Whigs. Lincoln enters politics in that era. But they didn't have parties like we think of them, even though those parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, and then the Democrats and the Republicans, they were organizations. They didn't have voter registration. There weren't DNCs and RNCs with professional staff. There were no reporting requirements for contributions. It was a party system that wasn't very systematic, is how I put it.
And I mean, obviously, there was a lot of anti party kind of belief or ideology in American politics. It's part of what the founders do. How did Lincoln feel about being partisan, not just being a party builder, but how did he feel about party?
Well, I think that's the right question to ask. Because what he did was reframe American democracy as partisan democracy. The founders feared parties. They still engaged in partisanship, but they feared it. Lincoln was able to explain how democracy could survive partisanship and even how partisanship could help democracy thrive. Um, and that's, I think, what we need from him right now. We need what you call responsible partisanship. We need leaders like Lincoln who can find ways to mobilize their supporters to battle with their opponents, but recognize that those opponents aren't enemies, and then bring everybody together again to see through the partisanship and recognize each other as Americans.
And can you talk a little bit? Obviously, there's a lot of interesting figures in your book. One is obviously Stephen Douglas and Lincoln's interactions, struggles with him. Can you talk a little bit about their relationship and how he handled Stephen Douglas as he engaged in this party building process?
So they're rivals from early on. Lincoln kind of detests him from early on. Douglas and Lincoln are opposite personalities. Uh, Douglas is a kind of a bully. He blusters. He's smart and he's street tough, but he and Lincoln don't see eye to eye on many issues. But what I try to show in the book that I think people have forgotten is that Douglas was such a thin-skinned, combative figure that he got into several feuds within his own party. And at one point in the 1850s, he's engaged in a feud with President James Buchanan that's so disruptive, he almost becomes a Republican. And the Eastern Republican leaders, like the National Party elite, they wanted to make him a Republican. And Lincoln's ability to mobilize against that, which would have been a total sacrifice of principle, that's what made him president. And so historians of the period know about all of this, but most people have forgotten it. And I try to show why it was so important. I say Lincoln wasn't an anti-slavery radical, but he became an ultra Republican. And he understood that parties have to stand for things. And his willingness to draw that line is what makes the Lincoln Douglas debates and the campaign of 1858 possible. And then it's what makes Lincoln a leader for the Republican Party and makes him their nominee in 1860.
Can you talk a little bit more about that, meaning how he navigated that tension of coalition building and kind of practical electoral considerations with this core principle that ultimately really defines a lot of how we remember the Republican Party from that era? How did you navigate all of that during this period?
Well, this is going to sound very familiar, especially this week. But all parties have trouble deciding who to stand with and who to cancel or push out of the coalition. And in Lincoln's case, and in those days, they talked about fusion and ultraism. And so Lincoln was always a fusionist when he was a Whig. He said, stand with anybody who stands right. But there were still people and still views that he knew had to be kept outside of a party that had to recognize some principle. And for Lincoln, the organizing principle of the Republican Party was that slavery was wrong. See, sometimes I think like our social studies teachers in the classroom get this confused. The policy was to contain slavery, to stop its spread into the Western territories. But the principle behind that policy was that slavery was wrong. And Stephen Douglas would never accept that principle. And for Lincoln, that was the litmus test. If you can't accept the principle that slavery is wrong, you can't be a Republican.
And as Lincoln's making those decisions, how are others in the party responding to him? I mean, he's not acting alone. So, are there people pushing back and saying that's too much? You're not being practical. How does that play out?
From the beginning to the end, always pushback. No matter who you are, no matter how great a leader, there's always critics, carping, undermining. You know how that is. It's in any era, but it was especially true for Lincoln. And in fact, if you're a Democrat today, one of the things you could recognize in Lincoln's leadership of the Republican Party during the 1850s was how important it was for him to unify a movement in opposition and how difficult that was. And he's there in 1859 working behind the scenes to try to get the radical and conservative factions of the Republican Party to line up together. He's warning them not to chase rabbits and to avoid distractions and to be focused and pragmatic, but also at the end principled. And that balancing act is hard, and he, almost failed, but he succeeded, became president, and then, of course, the whole process starts all over again, trying to manage the Unionist coalition during the Civil War.
Before we get to that period, you have a great quote in 1859 by the editor of the New York Evening Post, who called for the support of representative men. What did that term mean, and how does that connect to Lincoln?
So nowadays, people tend to remember Lincoln as an available candidate, like a blank slate. He came out of nowhere. But he wasn't. A representative man was a commonly used term then. It kind of dates back to Emerson, talking about other types of figures. But in the hands of the journalists in 1860, it represented a leader who shaped opinion and brought people together. And Lincoln was a representative man from Illinois, meaning a party boss. And then he offered a pathway toward a national leader. And that's what Lincoln called himself when he was president-elect. He goes on a tour of the free states from Illinois to Washington in 1861. He says he's been elected as the nation's representative man. And that's the term we should use to describe him, not as the most available candidate, but as the candidate with the greatest leadership qualities.
By the way, was it inevitable that he would be the nominee in 1860?
Nothing's inevitable in history, of course. He wasn't the front runner. I think most people know that. But he had a deliberate campaign. They were kind of the second choice candidate, and they worked their way out from strength in the Midwest. The leading candidate, William Seward, was somebody who had lots of enemies and created some antagonism within the party. Of course, they were worried about what we call swing states. They called doubtful states, and Lincoln represented the best candidate for winning over those doubtful states. And even though he didn't attend the convention, he kind of designed the strategy that helped him win the nomination on the third round in 1860. And it was, by the way, no accident that the convention was in Chicago. He helped arrange for that choice behind the scenes. It's part of his genius as a behind the scenes leader.
And he becomes president, and there some of his vision is fulfilled as the nation itself falls apart. How does he think about his first major message, the inaugural address, in terms of how he's thinking of the party and the task ahead with the nation? What are some of the debates about the inaugural?
Well, when I'm going around right now talking to different political groups and student groups, I try to make the case that this message in the inaugural is the one that should be most resonant for us. Uh, Lincoln defined union in the inauguration. Look, the Southerners viewed the Union as a compact of states. And most social studies teachers today, most Americans today, think of the Union as just a kind of abstraction for the nation, like we the people. But Lincoln is very precise. He understands that the Union is really a union between the electoral majority and the electoral minority, between the winners and losers in an election. This is what you call in your work responsible partisanship. Okay, you argue in a campaign, and then in an inauguration, you bring people together to see their common bonds and interests. And what Lincoln was doing in March of 1861 is he was trying to convince especially the remaining Southern slave states, that they had more common interest in remaining Americans than in joining the secession movement. And, like I said, Lincoln's precise. So it's a question of math that sometimes people today forget. There were 15 slave states. Only 7 had seceded by the time of Lincoln's inaugural. So he's pitching this message to the remaining 8 states. If he wins over all of those 8 states, secession dies in its infancy. If he loses all of those 8 states to the Confederacy, then the Union falls apart. But he split them with that message. The point of that message is that it's majority rule in this constitutional republic, but the minorities have rights. And Lincoln was trying to convey to Southerners that he would respect their rights as slaveholders that had been kind of implicitly guaranteed by the Constitution, even though his party believed that slavery was wrong. Presidents have responsibilities to their opponents, not just to their fellow partisans. That's the message that's getting lost today. We need to remind everybody that opponents are not enemies, and disagreement is not the basis for treason. And that's, I think, what Lincoln understood and what he tried to convey in March 1861.
And once he's in office, you talk a lot in the book about appointments, which is obviously one of the big tools that party leaders had. How does he use nominations, appointments? How does he use all of that to try to solidify his political position?
So things were a lot different then, although we might be heading back to that era, depending on Supreme Court decisions in the docket. Back then, there was no professional civil service. It was all partisans. To the victor belong the spoils. Lincoln is there right after the firing on Fort Sumter. He's there in a meeting in the White House where they're doling out patronage at the New York Customs House, and they're trying to, figure out a way to reward the different factions of the Republican Party. It was almost wholesale removal back then. Now we've changed, you know, the partisanship and the spoils system. That was a byproduct of the 19th century, and in the 20th century, we've developed a kind of professional, administrative class. That's what's at stake in these pending Supreme Court decisions. But Lincoln lived in a world where, you know, it was all partisan all the time, and he managed it, but it occupied an awful lot of his time.
Is he just for readers who have not read the book, can you describe a normal times president? Very early on, starts thinking about the midterms, starts thinking about reelection, basic concerns about partisan power. Um, how much is Lincoln thinking about this? Is he thinking about the midterms pretty early on and making calculations about that?
So there were many differences in that era. So first of all, they didn't have midterms all at once. They had elections all throughout every year. There were congressional elections scattered in different months and different times. In effect, there were important midterm elections that started in 1861. Most of them were in 1862, but there were more in 1863. A congressman would get elected in November, let's say, of 1862 and wouldn't begin service until December of 1863. So there's an awful long lag, you know, between the sessions of Congress. It was quite different, which meant that Lincoln is always facing the importance of elections, state and federal elections, all 4 years of his service as president. In the book, I argue that he wasn't focused on his own reelection so much as he was focused on building a Union Party that would include Republicans, but also figure out a way to reach out to conservatives and to pro-war Democrats. And that's the great development of the war that helped save the Union.
And how did that strain some of his support? Obviously, there's a bend on principle as he's thinking of what to do with the party. Does he get a lot of pushback? Is there fallout from that?
So, you know, there's plenty of fallout, but like William Henry Seward, the Secretary of State, he's kind of leading a no party movement. That's what they called it. It's kind of like a bipartisanship call. And he was trying to avoid party labels and create a kind of wartime coalition. And then there were more radical figures like Secretary of Treasury Salmon Chase, who were arguing for an unconditional Union Party that would make emancipation its centerpiece. And Lincoln is navigating between them, and he argues for a Union Party that embraces ultra measures like emancipation or the abolition of slavery, but does so in the name of a kind of multi-partisanship where, you know, it offers Democrats and conservatives a role in that government as long as they accept the principles of the coalition. They're saving the Union, but in order to do that, they have to abolish slavery. And anyone who's willing to accept that equation becomes a Unionist under Lincoln's leadership, and that ultimately is how he prevails.
And before I get to my final set of questions, I want to thank everyone who is watching us. And we will send this out. It's going to go first through Matthew's Substack. We had a technical issue, and then I'll resend it to all the subscribers. So thank you for being subscribers, and hope some of you will consider becoming paid subscribers to support this kind of work and these kinds of conversations. So, 1864 is obviously an important year. How does kind of he go with these tensions and his desire to make a unionist vision for the party? How does he go about winning reelection, and primarily strategically? How is he thinking about all of this?
Well, he's building the coalition. He's trying to keep everyone on board. He makes deals with people like Frederick Douglass. But you know, at the end of the day, I think what's most amazing about it is that he perseveres with the election. So there's a moment in August of '64 where plenty of people think that it's falling apart, that people are tired of the war, that he might lose. Lincoln never thinks he's going to lose, but he prepares for that possibility. But any other lesser figure would have just canceled the elections. And that's what he said after it was all over. He said, "We cannot have free government without elections." And that was a profound statement from somebody who said, we could have free government without habeas corpus, but we have to let the people decide. And if they choose wrong, they choose wrong, but we have to have faith that they'll choose right. And he felt vindicated by that after the election was over.
And so there was never a moment that he really considered not having the election in the middle of a war.
Well, look, I titled my Substack, What Would Lincoln Do? But the truth is, I'm not inside his head. It's all guesses. But there's no written statement from him anywhere indicating that he ever seriously considered giving up faith in democracy or the people. And that's, I think, the profound North Star that every modern politician should remember. You have to reaffirm the faith in democracy in order to be worthy of being an heir to Abraham Lincoln.
Did partisanship, do you think, ever, from what you saw, impact anything involving military strategy? Meaning, you see in foreign policy often that there's political considerations. Was that ever true with Civil War military policy?
Yeah, all the time. There were political wire pulling generals, there were Republican generals, Democratic generals. There was a constant battle behind the scenes. There was talk of military coup. It was ugly. Just people today feel grim and everybody's nervous, but it was. I'm not talking about the battle with the Confederates. I'm talking about the battle within the Union coalition. It was quite ugly, and so people sometimes can find some perspective in that. It's always a fight. It's always a fight in American history. You know that, but I think it's important for people to remember that.
Before I get to my final question, remind everyone the book is called Boss Lincoln, The Partisan Life of Abraham Lincoln by Matthew Pinsker. And I really recommend this book. I think whether you are a student of the Civil War, of that era, or even of party and how American politics works, it's a very fresh take on something that's difficult to do with someone so familiar and written about as Lincoln. So that leads me to ask for you, I mean, once you were done with the research and the writing, how does it make you rethink not just Lincoln, but this moment in American political history once you've recovered the partisan element of Lincoln's career?
I know this is going to sound unbelievable, but it gives me confidence. I'm not. I'm worried like everybody, but I have faith. It didn't look. It didn't look. It it didn't look easy when Lincoln was president. I know that it doesn't seem like we have any Lincolns around us right now, but they didn't think Lincoln was Lincoln either. I believe that we've overcome worse, and I think we'll overcome this. So I leave this conversation, full of confidence for the future, determination.
One last question. Sorry, I mean, it's called Boss Lincoln. That quickly evokes images for historical fans, machine bosses and party bosses. You don't think of this in a negative way necessarily at all. I mean, you're not trying to undercut Lincoln's reputation by presenting him as someone who thought about party. And thus, you're writing about party in a different way than I think we often hear about today.
Right. Look, Lincoln was a great communicator. He was a poet of democracy. I agree with all of that. But if you think that he won the Civil War by giving a nice speech at Gettysburg, you're a fool. He was tough. That's what I mean by Boss Lincoln. You have to be tough to preserve democracy.
Great message, important one, terrific book. Pre-order it, and you'll have it soon. It's a great gift for people who have family or friends who love to read about this period. So, Matthew, thank you for joining the long view, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you. I've always been an admirer and longtime subscriber, first time caller. So it's been great. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Bye.